Ah, on va le petit lumière rouge, c'est bon ça?
Ah oui? Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's BRACE seminar. Very, very happy to see you all here, and of course, everyone who's joining us online. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinabeg nations. Excuse me. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. So we're very pleased that Professor Sébastien Sauvé has agreed to join us today for this special BRACE seminar. Professor Sauvé is a full professor in environmental chemistry and the outgoing Associate Dean of Research and Creation of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Université de Montréal. He's also a foreign correspondent to the Académie d'Agriculture de France. His laboratory works on a variety of subjects, going from contaminated soils, circular economy, blue-green algae, ultra-trace analysis using mass spectrometry, as well as the impacts of emerging contaminants on health and the environment. Professor Sauvé has published more than 300 papers and book chapters, and interestingly, he's also a McGill alum. So thank you so much for joining us today. And today he'll be speaking about PFAS and where are we now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie. Nice opportunity. It's nice to be talking to you about PFAS. It's funny to be coming here to talk about PFAS. It's half of the work of PFAS I've done with Jinxia right here. So I hope I'll get you a different, somewhat different perspective. All right. So I'll go quickly on the introduction, but history. This really started not quite a century ago. Around 38 in 1950 with both DuPont and 3M doing PTFE and PFOS. It was for a very long time believed that it was not toxic, so we could use it and we could do all sorts of things with it without having any problems. I do like this old figure of the happy pan. Where do they come from now? Just make sure I don't step on anything. So really now the issues with PFAS and the problems that we're seeing is it's used a lot in firefighting foams and in aircraft and other fluids belonging to those fire departments. In firefighter training. Firefighter training is really one of the major sources that we see across problems for drinking water sources. Cosmetics, actually had issues in the lab because some of the cosmetics analysis we did, and we had background issues for 2 months afterwards because the level was just too high in those cosmetics. Stuff that we put on our skin. And then sportswear, there's a lot. If the clothing breathes wonderfully but is water resistant, that's a little bit of magic, and that little bit of magic comes with PFAS. Ski waxes. The sofa is not there at random. And I'm pretty sure that the carpets here is probably having some PFAS. The furniture is having some PFAS. If it's stain guard and resistant to stains, it's made with PFAS most of the times. And then fast food and wrappings. If it's when we were young, at least when I was young, paper and cardboard was not resistant to water and fat. So if paper and cardboard is resistant to water and fat, it's because it's treated. And the easiest and cheapest way of doing this is to put PFAS on the material. So it does open an issue as we are regulating or trying to move away from single-use plastics, and we're moving towards compostable cardboard material that's treated with PFAS. We might be switching from one problem to another. So this is where they come from. For about 2 decades, we've been knowing that there's been some concern and some issues because the compounds do bioaccumulate. So We still believed at the time that it was not really toxic, but we were starting to have some concern because we were seeing very high levels, and I'm putting in some polar bear data here, but you have sea mammals. There's a ton of data out there, but the polar bear is pretty atrocious in terms of concentration that we see in their livers in terms of PFOA and PFOS. And this was later confirmed that it's pretty much everywhere, including humans, blood, serum, maternal milk. And if you have the right instruments, any human biomarker sample will have detectable traces of PFAS nowadays. So it's everywhere. So really, earlier on, we were just starting to be worried because it accumulates, but there still was not any concern directly related to the effect or the impacts it would have. It's just we were seeing that it keeps bioaccumulating into living organisms. And well, at some point we just thought that this might not be so good. 2 movies. Well, this is really a Hollywood movie disguised as a documentary. Or maybe it's a documentary disguised as a Hollywood movie. You watch it and you tell me which way. But this is pretty much, for those that remember, it's a modern version of Erin Brockovich. Erin Brockovich was a problem with chromium or chromate. This is a problem with PFAS. So this is, as far as I can tell, totally based on true facts. None of this is really a novel. It's just what happened in the United States. And The Devil We Know, that's on YouTube. That's more easy to find. And that's really more of a documentary, but if you're interested, there's quite a bit of information. What it is, that's the model version of a PFAS. So it's a chemical compound. It's synthesized in the 40s. It only happens if it's made by chemists in a laboratory. There's no way you can get this naturally in the environment. If you find it, well, it's everywhere. So you can certainly find it somewhere in the environment, but if you find it in the environment, it's because it made its way from a lab into a product, into the air, the water, or whatever. It ends up in the environment. It's not naturally occurring. And basically, you have a chain of carbon that is saturated for the perfluorinated compound, or almost saturated for the polyfluorinated compound, and you have a functional group at the end. So basically, this is the basic structure is a chain. So think of it like an oil that is saturated or nearly saturated with fluorine, and some functional group at the other end. You can have a long chain, a short chain, a very long chain. You can start making it branch. You can draw it various ways, and chemists are very clever in finding all sorts of ways of drawing this thing. And you can change whatever you put at the other end. And this makes up for tons of combination, and there's reputed to be more than 14 or 20,000 different combinations of PFAS. They've not all been measured or confirmed to exist, but structurally, chemically, we can have more than 10,000 different combinations of PFAS. So in terms of regulation and fate and treatment, it very quickly becomes a nightmare, because, I mean, if the normal way of regulating compound is you find the evidence that lead is toxic, and the more information we have, the more we regulate that one compound. If we started with PFAS, we started with PFOS and PFOA, so we started with 2, and we're still adding up to it. But there's no way that we can do this for 10,000 compounds. We'll never see the end of it. Or professors like us are going to get money forever to try and do it, but this is not going to happen. And we're always going to be one step behind, because the minute we highlight 10 more PFAS that need to be regulated, the industry is going to be using 100 new. And while we do the work on those 100 new, they're going to be already on the 1,000 next. So we have to change how we regulate, and how we basically change the burden. The burden on proving that things are toxic should not be on professors and academic. It should be on whoever is wanting to sell it, to make the proof for the demonstration that there's no potential toxic effects. So I mentioned it. We have PFOA and PFOS. So basically the first two villains that have been regulated and banned in all sorts of regulation. And this is an idea of the number or different structure that they can take shape nowadays. So it makes it quickly complicated, both in terms of the toxicology of doing the analysis in the lab, or if you want, there's a few engineers in the room, if you want to treat and remove these things, well, the chemistry here makes a huge difference in terms of how you have to deal with it and how it transforms into the environment, because they don't behave and stay in the corner. Some of these things will biotransform and will change, and as you try to, if you're chemically treating them or oxidize them, they will transform. The nickname forever chemical is probably a misnomer, because yeah, they are persistent, they do bioaccumulate, but they do transform and they do degrade. I mean, degradation is probably on the order of decades, so PCBs and metals are much more forever than PFAS are, but the nickname sticks. It probably contributes to the phobia over PFAS. So keep in mind that this really complicates analysis, treatment, and how to deal with it. So regulations in drinking water. So you can sort of see it in the movie. It started at 150 nanograms per liter in West Virginia a long time ago. This was followed quickly by the US EPA that had some guidelines at 400 nanograms per liter for PFOA in 2009. This was revised at 70 for PFOA, and then they added PFOS in 2016. In Canada, we're still at a guideline of 600 nanograms of PFOS or 200 nanograms per liter of PFOA. The US and Canada have proposed new guidelines, and we'll get to those, but those are proposed that have had some recommendation and comments from people, but they have not been adopted yet. So really, in terms of what's applicable, that's what we have. The EU did the work a bit earlier than Canada and the US in their new recommendation. So it looks better here, but it's not so much. The EU has a target that should not be above 100 for about 20 PFAS. So they've selected 20 of the most current PFAS, and they figured that those 20 should not be above 100. So it's definitely better than these old regulations, but it's not as strict as the newer recommendation from Canada and the US. Why do we care? Why do we worry? So the effects on health, lipid metabolism, i.e. cholesterol, and then some issues maybe with glucose metabolism also. Cancer, thyroid problems. There's a lot of thyroid problems that are creeping up. Birth weight, a lot of data showing that the babies from mother having a high body burden of PFAS will have a lower birth weight. There's some liver damage and liver enzyme malfunctions, and the immune system, which I think I've highlighted. For a long time, the immune system, or more recently, has been one of the focus because it happens at very, very low concentration. So the immune system gets to be demonstrably affected at very low concentrations. So this has sort of been one of the motivation to further investigate and further restrict regulations on PFAS. Once that being said, we have to put that into perspective. So, and that perspective that I like to use is the health risk for most people's exposure to PFAS and the risk associated with these issues is really usually lower than anyone who smokes, obesity, lack of exercise, bad health habits will have a higher risk to your health than standard or medium to high level of PFAS exposure. So we have to put those things into perspective. Nevertheless, one of the issues with PFAS and why it's been slow, apart maybe from cancer, that is really a scary one for the imagination. But even cancer, these are all slowly creeping things. None of this, I mean, you put a lot of PFAS in an aquarium and the trouts don't care. Nothing happens to the trout. There's very little acute toxicity. It's not something that's very toxic a priori. It's all over time, chronic exposure. They're all issues that can have an impact on health, but all chronically. So it's sort of always feel that we have the time, or it's not as urgent or as important as other things. But in the end, it might very well be. For vaccine, the immune system, we could have a very good demonstration because they tested for vaccine response. And basically, it's not easy to test the response of the immune system apart from vaccine. Because we tend to vaccinate almost all cohorts of children, and most people are vaccinated. And you can go back to a cohort of children that was vaccinated 3 years later. You take a blood sample, you measure the immune response to the vaccine, whether it's an antibody count or whatever you want to measure in terms of response. You also measure PFAS, and basically, every time you double the concentration of PFAS in the blood, there's a 25 less efficient response in terms of the vaccine. And that's been repeated many times with different vaccines in different populations, with children and adults. So it's very clear. Being exposed to PFAS reduces our response to vaccine. But then again, you don't die all of a sudden because the vaccine doesn't work. It just is one more chronic thing that builds up over time. But we're coming out of a pandemic. So the idea that our immune system is affected by exposure to PFAS that's everywhere, and that the vaccine doesn't respond as well, but it may also mean that our immune response is affected in other ways. We just don't have the tools to easily measure the immune response in all sorts of ways. The vaccine is the most easy one to measure. The other things are more difficult. So it does raise a lot of questions. So we'll move out in time to June 2022. The US EPA put out some health advisories. And I do remember discussing with Jin, we would say, well, these numbers are really low. And the first reflex, they say, well, they messed up with the units, or they made a mistake. There's 1,000 there's 1,000 scale that we need to correct for, but no, they did not mess up with the units. Maybe we could argue that they added a safety factor too many. Maybe this should be 10 times less, but just move the zero one bit. So these are nanograms per liter. So the same units that were around 100, 200, 600, 70 in the previous slide. These are not drinking water quality guidelines. These are health advisories. So basically, this is the level that the US EPA estimates has no impact on health. So if you want to make sure that there's absolutely no impact on your health, these are the concentrations that we would expect in drinking water to have no effect. So it more or less becomes a scenario like, I think it's on the next slide, like lead and arsenic. Lead and arsenic, the more toxicology we added and we discovered and learned, we've eventually realized that there's no safe exposure to lead or arsenic. Any exposure to lead has some impact on the neurodevelopment. Any exposure to arsenic contributes in some way to cancer. So basically, we are at a level where any exposure to PFAS has some effect on our health. In the States, they were really strict on PFOA and PFOS, the two banned ones. And they have two others that have a different level, and they don't deal with the others. The regulation demands that people measure all the other PFAS. There's a long list of what they need to measure, but they're not strictly regulated. But at least demanding that they do measure it all the time will build up the database eventually to have a better guideline. But the law in the United States is made so that unless they have the toxicology data to back something up, they cannot regulate it. It's just the way it works over there. So thresholds were really low. These thresholds would be, if you want, no impact on health according to the US EPA. And this has been debated. There's some other toxicologists that say that they went too low and they're too strict. But you just move it by a factor of 10 or even a factor of 100, and you're still in a zone where there's very, very, very low. Fentanyl, we're not seeing it, but it's February 23. So this was Health Canada that gave up. This is what has been proposed for drinking water in Canada. And basically, what they say, it's a bit like what they call LRA, as low as reasonably achievable. So it's really inspired from what I was mentioning about lead or arsenic. Any exposure is not good, so we should strive to make it as low as possible. But that as low as possible was a recommendation that it should not be above 30 nanograms per liter. So this is quite a bit lower than the previous numbers. It's still higher than the 0.004, but the 0.004 is not feasible. I mean, we can measure it in the lab, but very few labs can measure that in the lab. And even for us, it's kind of painful and difficult to measure such low concentration. 30 is much more reasonable. And that 30 is the summation. So it's a summation of about 30 PFAS. That's what has been proposed by Health Canada. A month later, I said it, this is like lead and arsenic. So basically, all RA, as low as reasonably achievable, we should try to make our exposure as little as possible. We cannot have a regulation saying it should be zero because the PFAS are literally everywhere. So it doesn't make sense to try and have water at zero when they're everywhere. It's just going to cost too much. And there's quite a bit of it in the food. So actually, at some point, it doesn't make sense to have almost zero exposure from what we drink if we have 1,000 times more from when we eat. We need to regulate exposure from food and water accordingly so that we minimize both risk. And then we were talking over lunch how much PFAS are we breathing right now in this room with a carpet and furnitures. It's a challenge to regulate. And basically, even in Quebec, they're working hard at the ministry, but you cannot have a method to regulate. You cannot regulate something before you have a method to measure it. And it's difficult to regulate it if you have the data that you've measured. So it's it's a loop where it's a bit difficult. So they have to propose methods at the same time as they propose a regulation. And you have to have the private labs that can do those analyses to a level that's similar to what we do in universities. And, well, they're not quite as careful as we do our work at the universities. But they're certified. We're not certified. PFAS, the regulations in March 23, that was the next step because the US EPA had shown that very, very low level of PFAS were having impacts on health. This was a proposed drinking water guideline. So that's very different. It's not a health advisory that's where we would like things to be in a healthy, perfect world. This is a drinking water guideline that's enforceable, and that's what the cities would need, or the water authorities. It's not always municipal in the United States. So this is online. And this is a year ago. So both the Canadian was in February 23. The USPA was in March 23. So both of these things were more than a year ago, or about a year ago. Should have been approved or put into regulation by now, or should come out soon. But well, there are political issues in the States and delays in Canada. So what they proposed. So the MCLG is, well, the target, it's 0, because those are recognized as carcinogenic, so it's automatic in the United States. If it's carcinogenic, the target, in as much as we can, should be 0. But the enforceable level, so it means that if you're above, you have to implement some sort of treatment or find another source or propose a solution, is 4. So in all those units that we've been talking, this is 4 nanograms per liter. Now this is not a summation, so it's a bit tricky comparing the 30 for the summation of 30 PFAS with individual levels. So PFAS and PFOA are at 4 each. So it's not the sum of the two that should be less than 4. Each of them should be below 4, but both of them could be at 3. In the States, that would be okay. And they have a hazard index for the next 4. So they have 4 other PFAS for which they have a hazard index. 2 of those at a level at 10, 1 at 9, 1 at 1,000. So you do the ratio of all these things, and the summed ratio should have a risk below 1. If I confused you, it's because it's confusing. So really, and in the end, it rarely applies because you don't get problems with these guys. Those 2 at 4 are really what's triggering the major problems and the major issue, because 4 nanograms per liter, that's very low. I don't have a slide, but 4 nanograms per liter, that would be 2 sugar cubes that you dilute in the Olympic Stadium, our Olympic Stadium here. You put 2 sugar cubes, you fill it with water, and you dilute. That will give you 4 nanograms per liter. So this is very low concentration. It's not simple to measure, and it's definitely not simple to remove if someone wants to have fun and try to remove it. It's really very low traces. But in the United States, they have to monitor for these, or they will have once it's approved. They will have to be open with the results and notify the public of the results, and they have to act on it. It's enforceable. So if they are above, they have to act on it. And we have none of that. Keep in mind that the proposed recommendation by Health Canada, it's a federal proposition. The provinces will need to integrate that because it's Health Canada, and the health recommendation is part of Health Canada. It's federal in some way, but the implementation of it is provincial in terms of jurisdiction. So it's going to be tricky in how each province is going to integrate it and enforce it or not. So here's the funny index that I was mentioning. So European Union, I did mention it, is the sum of 20 PFAS that should not be above 100. This was proposed in Europe, I think it was 21. So in 21, it was relatively audacious from them, and this was probably at the front of the parade, trying to regulate. But they asked the member countries to put that in place for January 26, which is still a little bit, it's 2 years from now. So the toxicology and the science of PFAS is evolving so fast that this is way outdated before it was even put in place. So those values are not, when you compare it with what's being proposed in Canada or in the United States, these are These are already outdated, and it's probably a bit tricky because usually the European Union are those that are really at the forefront and do apply the precautionary principle a bit more. But I don't even know if they have a procedure to correct a proposed legislation before it was even approved by all of the member countries. So they're sort of it's difficult if you think that we have issues in Canada with the different provinces. If you'd had 20 or so countries, it's even more complicated. They did have an ill-defined total PFAS summation approach that was possible to do, but they did not define how it should be measured. It's open up in the EU recommendation, but I don't see any EU country that has gone through that route. They all went through the other route of measuring the 20 PFAS that are regulated. There's some other values. 2 countries do a summation of those 4, which becomes sort of a health guideline. Denmark, the summation of these 4 should be below 2. So that becomes more strict than the United States. And the Netherlands, the summation of these 4 should be below 4. So these would be really low. So there you highlight a lot more potential issue and a lot more potential problems. But these are sort of health target values. I'm explaining that it's a bit difficult for those countries to try and be much more restrictive than the EU regulation, because they do have a federation and they have to respect some rules. So they can sort of work their way around it with health guidelines, but it's a bit tricky. These are the 20, if you're working on it, so they're there. If anyone wants this is saved, it's available. If you want the PDF, you just send me an email. So you don't need to note all of this. So try to summarize. The EU aims for a sum of 20 different PFAS that should not be above 100. Health Canada proposes that the sum of about 30 PFAS should not be above 30. The US EPA is really targeting 2 PFAS that should not be above 4 and includes some measurements for 4 others. So that's 3 different systems. So it's a bit tricky to compare because you're not comparing exactly the same things. In Quebec, when the first data was shown up or was made the news in Quebec, the response has been that the water quality is good, that the tap water meets all applicable guidelines, so it's safe to be drink. And remember that those proposed guidelines by Health Canada have not been adopted, so they're not applicable. So there's no guidelines in Quebec currently, so it's easy to say that water meets all applicable guidelines for something that's not yet regulated. So for now, public health in Quebec says that water everywhere in Quebec is okay, with one exception, and we'll get there. I have some data for that one exception. It took a while to convince them that maybe this one was a problem. This has been discussed in a paper if you're interested. And I got old data. That's funny because 2018 is not that old, but in terms of PFAS, given the scale and the speed of things, this is old data, where we collected a lot of water samples across Canada. And this is the data we get from all drinking water samples coming from the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River system. This is the data for the rest of Canada. There must have been, I think it must have been like 50 or 60 samples. So there's a fair number of samples. And it just shows there's totally different. There's 2 populations of water samples, whether it comes from the St. Lawrence Great Lakes or whether it's all other rivers and underground water. And basically it just shows that the Great Lakes have a lot of urban environment and a lot of discharge. So the whole Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River is contaminated. Now those levels around 15 are way below the 100 or in Europe. It is below the 30 that's proposed for Health Canada. it's for the most part below the 4 PFOA and PFOS, for the most part. But if we were to do the summation PFOA plus PFOS, anything here is no longer meeting those guidelines. So the tricky part here, at least in Quebec and probably Ontario, is half the people drink water that comes in some way from the St. Lawrence Great Lakes River system. And I didn't mention this, but drinking water treatment plants, unless they were specifically designed to remove PFAS with a very specific treatment, either with a charcoal or the resin or a flotation system, they do zip, nothing. At best, it's going to be 10%, maybe less PFAS on some days, and maybe 10% more on other days. It doesn't remove PFAS. So if it's gone through a drinking water treatment plant, basically we were measuring what was in the St. Lawrence River or whatever river we were measuring. So just highlighting that the St. Lawrence that is probably in the tap water at McGill, as well as on the whole island, is coming from the St. Lawrence. So I do have enthusiastic students that wanted to discover the province, and they've gone on to sample across the province of Quebec. So this was almost 500 samples, because on some of the sites, and especially when it was more contaminated, we went back again to take more samples. So this is not everything in Quebec, not all the cities. It's about a third of the municipalities within Quebec. But it was a fairly good sample size. And we could see and detect all sorts of PFAS. So this is the number of PFAS. And all of the little stars were not included in the recommended methods from the US EPA. So that just highlighted that we need to work on the methods because the range of those compounds is complicated. And this is the data that we see in those 463 samples. 2 of them were below our detection limits. So there were 2 samples. I think there was Percé in Gaspésie and one other that I forget that was, as far as we could tell, 0, but it probably was something that we could not measure. So it means it's everywhere. But the concentrations still are relatively low, so you have median concentration. So the median for the summation, we are up to 54 that we detected, is at 2. So overall, this is good news, because if we're comparing to the other numbers that we were looking at, for the most part in Quebec, the samples and the water is pretty good, and we don't have a lot of PFAS in most of those samples. The tricky part is that some of those include samples from the St. Lawrence River systems or from places that are more contaminated. And unfortunately, half of the Quebec population is taking its water from the St. Lawrence River system. And you can sort of see here that if you draw a line around 30 for the proposed Canadian guideline, well, all of these sample of tap water were above that proposed 30 nanogram per liter guideline. One of them was above 100, which is the proposed EU guideline. And quite a few were also above the US guideline, but it's calculated a bit differently. So quick comparison of underground versus surface water. Surface water higher than underground water, probably because of deposition from the air. So you're probably getting some dust and transformation byproducts into the lakes. So that medium concentration in of the different PFAS is a bit higher or twice as high, or even more. This is a log scale. So it's definitely higher in surface water. But most of the problems, we'll get there, where we have serious contamination issues, it's underground water. So it's the underground water that's been contaminated by firefighter training, by military sites or landfill sites. So the problems come from underground water, but overall surface water are a little bit more contaminated. And well, the PFOA and the PFOS is the more focused one. So this is the dots here on these maps are correlated with the concentration that we observed. So we can sort of see that we have a few hot spots for PFOA, PFOS. So this is near Granby. This is Saint-Donat. This is Val d'Or, not to name them, but this is l'Épiphanie. So we could see and highlight places where there were issues. PFOA and PFOS are strictly regulated. PFHXS and 6,2-FTS are not regulated in the United States, so they're not part of those range of 2 or 6, so there would no issue here. There would still have been an issue here because there's a lot of this guy, but there's also other things in the water at that spot, so this would still be regulated. This is the listing, so you can sort of see where issues were, and as it happens, it's so funny because I do work quite a bit with Benoît Barbeau at Polytechnique Montréal, engineering, doing water treatment. Well, his cottage is at Saint-Donat, so we had a supplier of contaminated water from our colleague. He just took it from where he lived. We have Val d'Or, l'Épiphanie, Sainte-Cécile-de-Milton, Sainte-Adèle, and the purple ones were cases where either PFOS or PFOA was above 4. So these would have hit the guidelines in the United States. What the total was below 30. Because if you have just 2 that are above 4, you can still have a total that's below 30. I'll try to go a bit more quickly. So overall, this is summarizing. And if we're comparing the data in Canada with the regulation between Canada and the United States, the American recommendation is more strict. It will highlight more places where there are issues. If we wanted the Canadian guidelines to be as strict, we would have to reduce from 30 to about 15. But that would mean that the St. Lawrence River would be on the borderline. And I'm not arguing that we should aim for 15, because I think 30 is probably reasonable, because there are other sources that are a problem. But the comparison currently is that what they're doing in the United States for just 2 PFAS is probably more strict, but is blind to a whole range of PFAS that we sometimes see. So it's difficult to compare. This is l'Abbé, this data that came after the first study. L'Abbé is around Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. We had a first sample that was around 120, so it made quite a stir. The Ministry of the Environment of the city took samples of their own. This data is data from the Ministry of the Environment and the city that were going up to 350. We collected a second series of samples that were not as bad, but still above the 30 guideline. And we retook some new samples in August. So there's really a problem in terms of the concentration in Saguenay. The public health around Saguenay maintains to this day that the water is perfectly good to drink, but they invested $12 million to have a temporary water treatment in l'Abbé area, because it's better that they drink better water, but there's no problem with the water anyways. I must be the only one that thought it was a bit weird. That's Sainte-Cécile-de-Milton. These are concentration. This is PFOA and PFOS, so those are the ones that are really strictly regulated in the United States. We have very high concentration. This is the summation of the PFAS that we collected there. 30 would be the level in Canada that's being proposed, and there's one home where the average was around 400. So in that case, the local public health did mention that pregnant women and young children should not drink the tap water, and that other people should restrict their use of drinking water. I don't know how you do that, but... and this is around Lyon. Lyon, those that don't know, they call it the Vallée de la Chimie, so there's a chemical manufacturing valley where, guess what, they were making PFAS. There's two manufacturing plants that were making different types of PFAS over decades. So I did work with citizen group over there, and they shipped me the samples, and we did the analysis, and this gives you an idea of the type of concentration that we're observing. Some of those are higher than the EU threshold, because we're sort of using the EU threshold. We're in France. Again, guess what the public health locally says? This is okay. This meets local regulation. It's a bit above. Don't worry. It's just a little bit above. So it's the same fight whether you're in France or here, but it's making it quite a stir. And here is the different types. And I just want to highlight that in Lyon, there's about 20% of the PFAS that we're measuring, or the mass of PFAS that we're measuring, that's for 3 PFAS that are not measured or not in the list of 20 of the European Union. So I don't think that the regulations need to have 100 PFAS, but the 20 or 30 that we pick need to be really well picked. So 30 is probably a good target, but we need to make sure that we don't forget important PFAS. I see that time is going. Biosolid made the news. So when we use PFAS, it ends up in wastewaters, and that PFAS in the wastewater will be, the treatments are better because it has a relatively high affinity for organic matter, so PFAS will be retained to a greater extent to the biosolids. The best use of biosolid is to land apply it where we grow crops, because it's full of organic matter, so that you have the carbon going back to the soil, building the organic matter in the soil. You have the nitrogen and the phosphorus going back to the soil, reducing the chemical fertilizer needs of the farmers. So this would be a beneficial loop. But if we're putting out PFAS into the environment and the biosolid is loaded with PFAS, we're putting those PFAS back into the land where we grow our food, and that might not be a good loop. That's circular, but that's probably not the circularity that we want. So we have to find what is the safe level of PFAS that we can allow to go on land before we're contaminating the crops and the cows and the milk and the farmers. And it's a bit tricky. We do have data. All of these on the left are normal, clean agricultural amendments. So this would be chicken manure, cow manure, different things. And look at the scale. It goes up to, I think I have, 2.5. And these are all municipal component, biosolids, municipal waste, or composted municipal waste. There's a whole series of materials. So I need to highlight that some of them are clean. So you can have clean biosolids from a city, but some of these are pretty big and pretty high. This is in France, remember, and France does have some manufacturing of PFAS. Luckily, we don't have any manufacturing plant of PFAS in Canada, but we do have places that use PFAS. So we have manufacturing plant that use a process that uses PFAS that can release a lot of PFAS, but it's never as bad as having a manufacturing plant where you have chemists making the stuff. And this is the list of what we see in Quebec and the different types of PFAS. And the funny one is that the most important one, well, those two, the first and the third, are a family of DPAP that are a bit more tricky to measure and that have not been measured as regularly. So it just shows that you have, I don't know, depending on the samples, it could be like a third of the sample mass of PFAS is made up from those two. So it's very important to measure. And 5-3 acid is a byproduct. It's not even something that's normally used. It's a byproduct of the degradation of other PFAS. So it makes it really tricky in terms of what we should be measuring, because all of this goes to, well, the best way would be to put them into agricultural fields as opposed to burning them or other things. And quickly on water and food. That's the last thing that we've been playing with lately. I'm comparing here. There's two levels of water. 880 milliliter a day, so that's what Statistics Canada estimates that we drink, more or less. So that's water that we would drink on average, each of us per day. And 2.5 liter is the amount of water that we consume throughout everything. So there can be some in your soup, there could be out if you have a stew, if you cook pasta. So there's more water that we consume even though we're not drinking water. If you take tea or coffee, for example, there's got to be some water in your tea or your coffee. So if you're drinking water that is at 30 nanograms per liter, so the Canadian guideline, this is the daily dose of PFAS you're getting. If you're unfortunate and you're in Val d'Or, well, this would be the sum of PFAS that you're getting from drinking or consuming that water at 100. And if your water is at 200, if you're in some places in l'Abbé, Sainte-Cécile, or Lyon, well, this is the amount of PFAS that you would be taking every day from drinking water or consuming different products. We have a few samples. We're building that up to get more data. This is if you eat chicken, a normal portion of chicken. This is pork. This is beef. So the food is somewhat, in this case, equivalent to what we would be getting from water at the limit for the Canadian guideline. And I did hide a few little things. Salmon, tuna, and seafood. And we can sort of see that, yes, some of the fish and seafood could be clean, but some of it is definitely not clean, so it probably depends. I don't know how we feel on the day that we ate that tuna, but some of it is much more contaminated. And we don't have a whole lot of information on this, so we're trying to build a data set to better understand. And that's also what I was saying, but I don't think we need to get the regulation more strict than 30. Doesn't make sense to me to get more strict regulations for water until we figured out what's happening with this, and until we restrict also, because there's some seafood. I mean, most of the seafood are okay, but I don't know what these two things are, but maybe the scallops wouldn't be good. I'm not saying it's scallop, I don't remember, but definitely you see there's a tuna that's right there, and there's a tuna that's right here. And tuna was, and I think it was the first time measured, so I was really scared, but I like tuna and like sushi. I think it's nice. But it depends. But tuna is a very big carnivorous fish, so it does make sense because it's a bioaccumulative species. We think about the little canned and the little sushi, but tuna is a huge monster. It's a really big fish. And I see people moving. This is bad. Taking too long time. I don't think that we should move to do a total ban completely. There are some beneficial use of PFAS for some medical usage where we need the PFAS. And currently, my colleagues cannot do batteries for electric cars without PFAS. There are ways to do it, but there's no way that the manufacturing plant can implement those things. So we probably need to have some sort of exception for those use, but these would be non-dispersive use. We have to make sure that they don't emit PFAS all over the place, but we definitely don't need waterproof cosmetics that are loaded with PFAS or popcorn wrapping with PFAS or hamburger wrapping with PFAS. And it's convenient to have sportswear that resist to water and are breathable, but I don't think we need them that bad. And just trying to say that it's difficult to talk about PFAS because they're complicated. And thank you very much.